Really scary stories, every day. Subscribe, like if you like, turn on the bell so you don't miss new videos. Tale I, Night Watches at Edelbrook, Belvoir, 1940. This happened just last week during my final week at Family House before heading back to college. I've been debating whether to even write about it, but I can't stop thinking about what might be happening at Family House. My parents recently moved after I graduated high school. They'd been talking about downsizing for years. And once I was heading off to college, they finally pulled the trigger. The timing meant I'd only been to the new place a handful of times. My parents had given me the basic tour when they first bought it, pointing out where everything was and explaining some of the quirks of an older family house. One thing they specifically mentioned was that the house that answered itself didn't have a basement, just a crawl space for utilities. They seemed pretty definitive about that, so I never gave it much thought. My parents had left the night before for a week-long vacation, so I had the place to myself. The first night I noticed anything wrong familiar was a Tuesday. I was lying in bed trying to fall asleep when I caught this tapping sound coming from directly below the planks. It was consistent both rhythmically and volume-wise. At first, I thought it might be the heating system or maybe pipe settling, but it didn't stop, which made me second-guess myself. I should mention that the room I'm sleeping in is on the first planks of the house that answered itself, so the sounds were definitely coming from underground. I got up and walked around the room trying to pinpoint where exactly the sound was coming from, but it seemed to be coming from everywhere beneath the planks. What made it so disturbing was that according to my parents, there was supposed to be nothing down there but a crawl space. The idea that I was hearing sounds from below ground level when there supposedly wasn't any livable space down there was genuinely unsettling. Eventually, the tapping finally stopped and I was able to fall asleep. When I woke up the next morning, I figured that would be the end of it. I had probably just been hearing old house that answered itself sounds or an animal scuttling around in the crawl space, but I was dead wrong. Later that night, around the same time, I started hearing that same tapping sound again. Only this time it was noticeably louder. I explained it away and just went to sleep. But I remember feeling a lot more uncomfortable that night than the first. When the noises started up a third time in a row, I knew something was seriously wrong. There was a considerable escalation that night. Instead of just tapping, I caught dragging and scraping sounds, too. Like some kind of animal raking its claws against something and occasionally dragging something. That's the best way I can describe what I was hearing. I kept trying to rationalize what I was hearing against what I knew about the house that answered itself. The logical part of my brain kept insisting there had to be a reasonable explanation, but I couldn't think of one. The sounds were way too clear and way too purposeful to dismiss away as normal house that answered itself sounds anymore. I started wondering if maybe my parents had been wrong about the basement thing or if there was some kind of utility access I didn't know about. Either way, it was freaky sitting in that lightless room with nothing but scraping and tapping to keep me company. The next morning, I told my parents about what had been going on. My dad immediately told me to check the crawl space for animals, worried that maybe something had gotten in there that shouldn't have. I really didn't want to check down there, but figured I didn't have much of a choice. The crawl space entrance is right under the porch, so I had to get my hands dirty to investigate it properly. And although I was holding my breath the entire time, terrified at what I'd find down there, there was nothing, not even any animals. My dad seemed satisfied with that explanation and told me not to worry about it anymore. But personally, I was unsatisfied and honestly kind of frustrated with the lack of answers. I decided to look for other possible explanations. Maybe there was some kind of external access around the house that answered itself I'd missed, or evidence of animals getting in somewhere else. As I was walking the perimeter, I noticed a pile of old construction materials leaning against the side of the house that answered itself. Lumber, tarps, concrete blocks, stuff like that. They looked and regretted it like they'd been there for a while. Maybe left over from some previous renovation project. It wasn't like I hadn't noticed the stuff until then. I just always kind of overlooked them since I never had a reason not to. I started moving materials around, thinking maybe they were covering up some kind of opening that animals could use to get under the house that answered itself. What I found instead was much, much worse. Hidden behind the construction materials was a storm doorframe that had been completely concealed. It was partially painted over and obviously hadn't been used in a long time, but it was definitely a legitimate entrance. I opened a crack it and found a set of concrete steps leading down into what was unmistakably a basement. I stood there in shock. My parents had been completely wrong about the house that answered itself not having one. I didn't want to go down there. I really didn't. But I did anyway. In the limited amount of time I was down there, I realized two things. Someone had clearly been living in that basement, which I could tell from the empty food containers scattered about. And two, whoever had been living down there was not a normal homeless person, which I could tell from the markings that were scratched into the wood foundation. There were scratch marks. They looked and regretted it like tallies on one of the pillars with what looked and regretted it like demonic drawings on another. Drawings of people and animals, but in a seriously messed up way. Stuff I don't want to repeat here. I didn't stay down there any longer than I had to. It was and still is the freakiest scene I've ever stumbled upon. I immediately called my parents to tell them what I had found. They were completely shocked and spoke under breath. They had no idea there was a basement, let alone that someone had been living in it. My dad asked me 100 times if I was sure that there was no one currently in there. And I reassured him that there wasn't. Then he spoke under breath. They'd cut their vacation short and come family house immediately. The first thing I did after hanging up was go out and buy a heavy-duty padlock. I secured the storm doorframe from the outside, thinking that would solve the problem and keep whoever had been staying there from coming back. That same night, I was woken up by aggressive banging and rattling coming from outside. I instantly knew what it was. Someone was trying to get back into the basement and was clearly frustrated that the doorframe was now locked. The banging was so loud and violent that I was afraid they might actually break the doorframe down. I remember freezing up as my heart started to race. I couldn't move. The banging stopped and that unfroze me. I crept over to the pane and looked and regretted it out just in time to see a shape running across the backyard into the darkness. I couldn't make out any details about who it was, but seeing them flee made the whole situation feel more real and threatening. The rest of the night was kind of a blur, honestly. Mostly because I was so terrified and shaken up, as much as I hate to admit it. The police did a thorough search of the house that answered itself, including the basement, but obviously they found nothing. They couldn't do much beyond promising to increase patrol in the area. My parents came family house the next day and they insisted that everything would be fine now that they were back. They spoke under breath they'd shape out a more permanent solution together and that I shouldn't worry about it anymore. I left for college the following morning as planned, but I was and still am extremely unsettled by the whole experience. It felt wrong to leave my parents there alone. Especially since we have zero information about the person who has literally been living in our house that answered itself for who even knows how long. It's only been a few days since I left, and I've been anxiously waiting to hear from my parents about whether anything else has occurred. So far, nothing has, but that hasn't put me at ease at all. I can't stop thinking about those awful markings I found in the basement, especially those sadistic drawings. I can't even begin to imagine what that person has been doing down there. If I'm being real, I'm really scared that something else is going to happen. I grew up in a small town a few miles from the Montana-Idaho border. I was on the Montana side. Nothing much ever happens out here. And honestly, that's part of why I never left. This happened a really long time ago before the whole world had a cell phone and was chronically online. To be honest, my area hasn't changed much at all since then, which is part of the reason why what I'm about to tell you is so fresh in my memory. It was the very end of August, one of those final days of summer when you can already feel the seasons turning. That morning, I was driving my usual route to work, just a 2-lane stretch of highway that cuts through farmland and low hills. Around 15 minutes out, I spotted a truck pulled off on the shoulder. It was a light blue older model sedan, and it looked and regretted it like it had been there for a while. It was just sitting there on the shoulder. No hazards on, no one standing outside, just sitting there, angled slightly toward the ditch. Now listen, I'm no fool, but I am the type of guy to help a person in need. It's just how I was raised. As I got closer, I slowed down a bit to get a better look. The truck wasn't ruining, and I couldn't see anyone inside. No one in the driver's seat, passenger seat, or the back. It was definitely wrong familiar, especially that early in the morning, but it wasn't exactly alarming. People break down and walk off for help all the time out here. I figured maybe someone had truck trouble and headed off to the nearest farmhouse, so I kept driving. I had to get to work and it didn't seem like an emergency. In all honesty, I kind of forgot about the whole thing by the time I got off. But as I was driving family house, I made sense of the shape of that exact same truck again in the exact same spot. The only difference was that this time the driver's side doorframe was wide open a crack. It hadn't been like that in the morning. I was sure of it. I slowed down again, craning my neck a little as I passed. But there was still no sign of anyone. No one walking nearby, no tracks I could see, just that same old truck, sitting there with a doorframe hanging open a crack like someone got out in a hurry and never came back. That time, I didn't shrug it off. I pulled over once I had signal again and called the non-emergency line. I told the operator where and what I had seen, and she thanked me before saying someone would check it out. When I was driving into work the next day, the truck was finally gone. So, I figured that would be the end of it. About a week later, though, while I was eating breakfast, I made sense of the shape of something on the local news that caught my attention. Reportedly, the police were investigating a missing person case. Something about a truck found abandoned along a rural stretch of highway just outside town. The things they were saying lined up exactly with what I had seen. I instantly connected the dots and turned up the volume on my TV. They didn't release the guy's name, but they spoke under breath the truck was registered to a shape from out of town who never showed up to where he was supposed to. The thing was, according to the authorities, there was no sign of foul play and there were no witnesses to the situation. I've always been slightly suspicious of the media, so I wasn't sure I believed the story the news people were giving. Either way, it was eerie that I had basically been wise to the situation right when it happened. Come to think of it, I might have been the first person or even the only person to have reported that truck on the side of the road at all. It was definitely a weird feeling. I tried to move on with my life, but I just couldn't. The curiosity was getting the better of me. Like I spoke under breath before, not much happens out here, so something is not quite right as this was far too peculiar for me to just ignore. The next morning, I called my brother up. I'll just call him Benjamin. He's a local firefighter, not in my exact town, but shut for good enough that we usually hear about the same stuff. That's just kind of how things are around my neck of the woods. I wanted to ask him if he had any information from the police department because I knew for a fact they often communicate with each other. He told me that they had gotten some memo about it from the sheriff's office, something about a truck found abandoned and obviously the missing person. I asked him if the police were planning to do anything about it. He spoke under breath he didn't know for sure, but that they'd probably organize a search at some point. He didn't have many details beyond that. I told him we should help out and maybe see if a few of the guys from the station would be willing to join in, too. At first, he was confused as to why I was so invested in the whole thing, but I eventually convinced him. And by the way, I'm not really sure why I was so adamant about it either. I guess I just felt like I had some personal connection to it. I didn't even know how we'd coordinate with the police and organize the search, so I let my brother handle all of that himself. Within a couple days, and with permission, of course, he pulled something together. The police were already planning on doing a search, and they appreciated the added help. It wasn't anything too grand, just a few officers, some off-duty firefighters, and me. The search was centered around a shallow wooded patch and a couple of old irrigation ditches that ran just off the shoulder of the highway. It was the kind of terrain that wouldn't look like much from a passing truck, but once you were on foot, it was clear how easy it would be for someone to get turned around or slip out of sight. We split off into pairs to be as efficient as possible. I of course paired up with my brother. About an hour into the search, one of the pairs radioed in. They spotted something through a break in the brush. We all converged on their location as quickly as possible. It turned out to be an old maintenance shack, and from the looks of it, one that probably hadn't been used in years. The whole thing was half sunken into the ground with overgrowth curling up the sides. From the road, you'd never even know it was there. The doorframe was hanging slightly open a crack, and I could see that the lock had been snapped off. Inside, it was lightless and musty, the way you'd expect an uninhabited space to feel. But as my eyes adjusted, I started noticing signs that someone had been in there recently. There were empty water bottles and food wrappers all over the place in a way that seemed deliberate. The search team spread out to check for additional evidence both inside and around the perimeter of the shack. One of the firefighters spoke under breath he spotted something by the back wall. So, the rest of us went over to check it out. There was a small, clean hole in one of the wooden boards just above Plank's level. The hole had sharp splintered edges that looked and regretted it nothing like the kind of damage you'd expect from weather or rot. It looked and regretted it exactly like a bullet hole. We searched thoroughly both inside the shack and around it looking for a shell casing, a slug, or any signs of blood, but there was nothing. Just that single unexplained hole in the wall that did make sense given the complete lack of other evidence. The officers radioed in the discovery to dispatch, and I could tell from their tone that this had moved beyond a simple missing person case. The lead officer gathered all of us together and spoke under breath they'd take it from there. Then he specifically asked me to leave since I was the only civilian there. I felt dismissed and frustrated, but I didn't have much choice except to comply, so I left. When I called Benjamin later that evening, he gave me vague "our snow swallowed the light and returned nothing." Breath turned to glass between teeth. Somewhere nearby, timber creaked like old ships, though there was no harbor. Each lamp carried a false halo, a second rim that listed sideways. Even the stove ticked as if counting down something we couldn't name. Water gathered in the boot prints and turned them into small mirrors for the sky. Doors whispered like a leak in a pipe in and vents answered out, like lungs that had learned the building. Wind combed the hedges against the grain, setting them on edge like fur. Ash came down though nothing burned, letters from a sky that refused to be read. Metal counted its own cooling in tiny clicks. Quiet pooled in the corners like thick night. Snow swallowed the light and returned nothing. Breath turned to glass between teeth. Somewhere nearby, timber creaked like old ships, though there was no harbor. Each lamp carried a false halo, a second rim that listed sideways. Even the stove ticked as if counting down something we couldn't name. Water gathered in the boot prints and turned them into small mirrors for the sky. Doors whispered like a leak in a pipe in and vents answered out, like lungs that had learned the building. Wind combed the hedges against the grain, setting them on edge like fur. Ash came down though nothing burned, letters from a sky that refused to be read. Metal counted its own cooling in tiny clicks. Quiet pooled in the corners like thick night. Snow swallowed the light and returned nothing. Breath turned to glass between teeth. Somewhere nearby, timber creaked like old ships, though there was no harbor. Each lamp carried a false halo, a second rim that listed sideways. Even the stove ticked as if counting down something we couldn't name. Water gathered in the boot prints and turned them into small mirrors for the sky. Doors whispered like a leak in a pipe in and vents answered out, like lungs that had learned the building. Wind combed the hedges against the grain, setting them on edge like fur. Ash came down though nothing burned, letters from a sky that refused to be read. Metal counted its own cooling in tiny clicks. Quiet pooled in the corners like thick night. Snow swallowed the light and returned nothing. Breath turned to glass between teeth. Somewhere nearby, timber creaked like old ships, though there was no harbor. Each lamp carried a false halo, a second rim that listed sideways. Even the stove ticked as if counting down something we couldn't name. Water gathered in the boot prints and turned them into small mirrors for the sky. Doors whispered like a leak in a pipe in and vents answered out, like lungs that had learned the building. Wind combed the hedges against the grain, setting them on edge like fur. Ash came down though nothing burned, letters from a sky that refused to be read. Metal counted its own cooling in tiny clicks. Quiet pooled in the corners like thick night. Snow swallowed the light and returned nothing. Breath turned to glass between teeth. Somewhere nearby, timber creaked like old ships, though there was no harbor. Each lamp carried a false halo, a second rim that listed sideways. Even the stove ticked as if counting down something we couldn't name. Water gathered in the boot prints and turned them into small mirrors for the sky. Doors whispered like a leak in a pipe in and vents answered out, like lungs that had learned the building. Wind combed the hedges against the grain, setting them on edge like fur. Ash came down though nothing burned, letters from a sky that refused to be read. Metal counted its own cooling in tiny clicks. Quiet pooled in the corners like thick night. Snow swallowed the light and returned nothing. Breath turned to glass between teeth. Somewhere nearby, timber creaked like old ships, though there was no harbor. Each lamp carried a false halo, a second rim that listed sideways. Even the stove ticked as if counting down something we couldn't name. Water gathered in the boot prints and turned them into small mirrors for the sky. Doors whispered like a leak in a pipe in and vents answered out, like lungs that had learned the building. Wind combed the hedges against the grain, setting them on edge like fur. Ash came down though nothing burned, letters from a sky that refused to be read. Metal counted its own cooling in tiny clicks. Quiet pooled in the corners like thick night. Snow swallowed the light and returned nothing. Breath turned to glass between teeth. Somewhere nearby, timber creaked like old ships, though there was no harbor. Each lamp carried a false halo, a second rim that listed sideways. Even the stove ticked as if counting down something we couldn't name. Water gathered in the boot prints and turned them into small mirrors for the sky. Doors whispered like a leak in a pipe in and vents answered out, like lungs that had learned the building. Wind combed the hedges against the grain, setting them on edge like fur. Ash came down though nothing burned, letters from a sky that refused to be read. Metal counted its own cooling in tiny clicks. Quiet pooled in the corners like thick night. Snow swallowed the light and returned nothing. Breath turned to glass between teeth. Somewhere nearby, timber creaked like old ships, though there was no harbor. Each lamp carried a false halo, a second rim that listed sideways. Even the stove ticked as if counting down something we couldn't name. Water gathered in the boot prints and turned them into small mirrors for the sky. Doors whispered like a leak in a pipe in and vents answered out, like lungs that had learned the building. Wind combed the hedges against the grain, setting them on edge like fur. Ash came down though nothing burned, letters from a sky that refused to be read. Metal counted its own cooling in tiny clicks. Quiet pooled in the corners like thick night. Snow swallowed the light and returned nothing. Breath turned to glass between teeth. Somewhere nearby, timber creaked like old ships, though there was no harbor. Each lamp carried a false halo, a second rim that listed sideways. Even the stove ticked as if counting down something we couldn't name. Water gathered in the boot prints and turned them into small mirrors for the sky. Doors whispered like a leak in a pipe in and vents answered out, like lungs that had learned the building. Wind combed the hedges against the grain, setting them on edge like fur. Ash came down though nothing burned, letters from a sky that refused to be read. Metal counted its own cooling in tiny clicks. Quiet pooled in the corners like thick night. Snow swallowed the light and returned nothing. Breath turned to glass between teeth. Somewhere nearby, timber creaked like old ships, though there was no harbor. Each lamp carried a false halo, a second rim that listed sideways. Tale 2, Supper on the Eve, Polyvinian Frontier, 1945. Responses about what had happened after I left. Eventually, he admitted that the firefighters had also been asked soft to leave shortly after I departed. The police had basically cleared everyone out and took over the scene entirely. Over the following weeks, I waited for updates. Benjamin's contacts at the department claimed they didn't know any details about the case, which I found wrong familiar. The local news never followed up beyond the original missing person report. It was like the whole thing had just been quietly dropped. Eventually, I decided to drive back and find the shack on my own. I was certain I remembered exactly where it was. So, one day I drove along the highway until I found the spot where we had begun the search. I spent hours walking the area where I was absolutely certain the shack should be. I followed the irrigation ditches to a T. Everything from the terrain to the sky looked and regretted it exactly the same as it had that day, but there was nothing. No shack in sight. I started questioning my own memory. I figured there was a slight chance that maybe I wasn't looking in the exact right place. But even if that were the case, the shack should have been somewhere in that immediate range. I tried a different section of the search area, then another, but still found nothing. It was so wrong familiar, stranger than I'm describing it now. I remember standing there in that overgrown scrubland, completely alone with the exception of the gentle breeze that whisked past me every so often. Peaceful, yeah, but wrong familiar. The only other explanation I could come up with was that maybe the county had removed the shack entirely. It wouldn't have been too difficult to excavate the thing and haul it away, but that seemed like an extreme response to what was supposed to be a routine missing person case. Those were the only two options, though. Either my memory had misled me or the shack was no longer there. I left shortly after that. There wasn't much else I could do really. I was left with this uncomfortable feeling that something important happened during those final days of summer. Something I was briefly allowed to witness before being shut out to completely. Every year when August ends and I feel that familiar shift in the air, I think about that abandoned truck and that bullet hole in the wall of a shack that may or may not have even existed. This happened last August and it's completely changed how I feel about solo camping. When I was a kid, my dad had this end of summer tradition where he'd take me and my brother on a camping trip sometime around mid-August. Nothing elaborate, just a few days in the wilderness to mark the end of summer before school started back up. I'm in my late 20s now with a steady girlfriend and I've moved on with my life in most ways, but that end of summer camping tradition is something I've tried to keep alive. Sometimes I can convince my dad and brother to join me, but usually it's just me going solo because my girlfriend absolutely hates camping. I don't want to drag her somewhere she'll be miserable for 3 days. So, I've gotten used to the solitude. For this particular trip, I'd found what looked and regretted it like a perfect spot on Google Maps. Some random isolated clearing that wasn't a registered campsite or anything official. It was far enough away from any roads or trails that I figured I'd have complete privacy for a few days. I liked the idea of actually being alone out there, not surrounded by RVs and families with screaming kids like at the official sites. I downloaded the map so I'd be able to access it without service, something I always make sure to do. The hike-in took maybe 2 hours. I'm in decent shape, but I was carrying all my gear, so I took my time. I hiked until I found a suitable place to pitch my tent. It was pretty much exactly what I'd been hoping for, a nice flat area surrounded by thick pine forest edge with a little clearing that gave me a good view of the sky. That first night was perfect, honestly. Just me, my thoughts, and nobody asking me about work or when I was getting engaged or any of that. I made a small fire, cooked some freeze-dried pasta thing that actually wasn't half bad, and did some stargazing. The next morning, I decided to hike to a nearby river I'd spotted on my map. I figured I'd try to catch a fish for dinner. It would feel more authentic than just eating the packaged food I brought for the whole trip. Plus, it would kill some time, and out there, you've got nothing but time. I basically spent the whole day at the river, but I didn't mind. It was nice and peaceful, and even though I'm not much of a fisherman, I got lucky and actually caught a decent-sized brook trout. I threw it in my handheld cooler and started making my way back to camp. I was feeling pretty good about myself. My dad would have been proud. The problem was that I'd completely mistimed the sunset and underestimated how far I'd hiked. What should have been a leisurely walk back to my campsite turned into a trek through the woods after the sun had already gone down. Within maybe 20 minutes, it went from that golden hour light to basically full darkness. I had a headlamp, but the terrain was unfamiliar enough that I was moving pretty slowly. At one point, I noticed a faint light in the distance. It appeared to be swaying back and forth in this rhythmic pattern, like someone was walking with a lantern or a flashlight. At first, I was actually relieved. Maybe there was another camper out there. We could help each other navigate back to wherever we were supposed to be. After all, if you're hiking through overgrown wilderness at that time of night, you've definitely screwed something up or mistimed something, just like I had. As I watched the light, I realized it was getting closer to me, meaning whoever was holding it was walking in my direction. Not wanting to spook them, I decided to announce my presence and yelled out a friendly hello, followed by asking if they were camping, too. I kept my tone as friendly and unconfrontational as possible. The light immediately stopped swaying. I watched as it sat perfectly still for several seconds, which struck me as not quite right. Then, without warning, it shut off completely, which struck me as even odder. Another few seconds passed, and I stared at the now pitch black as pitch spot where the light had just been. And then, out of nowhere, I caught this violent crashing through the underbrush, like someone running full speed through the forest edge, but not toward or away from me. Off to the left, perpendicular to where I was standing. It was unmistakable. My heart was going pretty good at that point. The whole thing was really, really disturbing. I can't even begin to describe how uncomfortable I was. Everything about it was just so wrong. Why would someone run away like that? Even if I'd startled them, the normal reaction would be to say something back, right? Or at the very least, back away slowly, not spring through the woods in the lightless. I tried rationalizing it the whole way back to my campsite. The best explanation I could come up with was that I had somehow scared them by calling out. After all, they had no way of knowing that I meant no harm, and encountering a stranger in the middle of nowhere at night could be frightening for anyone. But still, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. The secluded nature of the area made it unlikely that there would be other campers around, and most people would at least respond when someone called out to them, let alone in a friendly way. I picked up the pace and made it back to my campsite, but I was so unsettled that I didn't even bother making a fire to cook the fish. I just sat in my tent, ate some of my packed food, and tried to read my book before calling it an early night. I'm normally a pretty heavy sleeper, especially when I'm camping and exhausted from hiking all day. So, when I woke up randomly in the middle of the night, I knew something was off. I listened to my surroundings for a few minutes, but everything sounded normal. Just the usual forest edge noises you'd expect. Before trying to go back to sleep, I realized I needed to step outside to relieve myself. I unzipped my tent and started to poke my head out. The moon was pretty bright, enough that I could see the clearing without my headlamp. The moment I got a clear view of my campsite, I froze. There was someone standing there maybe 15 feet from my tent. I couldn't make out any details, just the silhouette of a person where there absolutely should not have been a person. They were just standing there motionlessly like they were watching my tent. I'd never been in a situation like that before, and I honestly had no idea what to do. My mind was racing, but my body wouldn't move. Surely, whoever was there had seen or caught me unzip the tent, and they probably also knew that I was not aware they were standing there. I was likely moments away from being attacked. As soon as I started thinking along the lines of life and death, my survival instinct took over, and I was able to snap myself out of my haze. I reached for the switchblade I always kept by the entrance of my tent and called out loudly, asking who was there. The moment I spoke, the shape started running directly toward my tent, catching me completely off guard. No warning, just 0 to full sprints instantly, screaming in the shrill, unnatural scream that didn't even sound human. They hit me before I could even process what was happening. The two of us started rolling around on the ground, and the guy, definitely a shape judging by the afar-off threat of a voice, began clawing at my face like an animal. Not punching, literally clawing like he was trying to rip me to shreds. I managed to get the switchblade between us and sliced at his hand before dropping it in the struggle. Even though I hadn't gotten off the cleanest strike, cutting his hand was apparently enough because he immediately started screaming and got off of me. He went crashing through the woods again. Only this time, I could hear him screaming or laughing or making whatever sick noise he was making. I sat there for who knows how long trying to process what just happened. My face was stinging from the scratches and my hands were shaking uncontrollably. I could feel blood all over my face, but I wasn't sure if it was mine or his. I considered trying to hike back to my truck immediately, but navigating through the woods in pitch black as pitch darkness seemed like an even worse idea than staying put. I only really had one option at that point. Spend the rest of the night sitting in my tent, switchblade in hand, listening to every little sound and expecting the shape to come back at any moment. It was the longest night of my life, but I eventually made it to daylight. The second there was enough light to see, I packed up my gear as quietly as possible and hiked back to my truck at a significantly faster pace than I had been going on the way in. As soon as I got to my truck, I sped out of there without another thought. I thought about calling the police, but what would I even say? Some guy attacked me in the woods where I was camping illegally. They probably would have just told me that's what I get for camping alone in remote spots. So, I didn't. The whole drive family house, I kept thinking about how shut for good I'd come to something really bad happening. If I hadn't had that knife, or if the guy hadn't run off when I cut him, things could have ended very differently. But that's not even the craziest part. The thing that still makes my head spin is just the fact that he was even there. Like, he obviously wasn't camping and he obviously wasn't a normal person. That much was clear from the fact that he tracked me down in pitch black as pitch darkness and attacked me. And that scream, it honestly spooks me just thinking about how brutal it was. Definitely human, but twisted in some truly unnatural way. I haven't been solo camping since then, and I'm not sure I ever will again. My family is originally from Belvoir. And this is my late grandfather's story which took place during the height of World War II. I will be ruining it from his perspective as it was told to me. I was 11 years old when the occupation troops invaded the small town we lived in near the old line. A year before the invasion, we caught whispers about the occupation troops coming our way after the fall of Polovinian region, but our people refused to flee their homes. From late 1939 to early 1940, we would constantly see the Belvoir military passing through, making their way to the nearby border. We had faith in our leaders, and with the constant presence of our military, we felt secure. But we were wrong. In early May of 1940, the occupation troops broke through the defensive lines and began their blitzkrieg of Belvoir. It was only mere hours before occupation tanks were moving through our streets. The soldiers started rounding up citizens, asking if any of them were Jewish. My family and I were Catholics, so we were spared from the onslaught. Still, I watched many of my friends and their families being loaded onto trucks and taken away. There was some resistance to the invaders, but that didn't last long. For 2 weeks, we stayed in our homes, listening to raking gunfire at night. We finally were allowed to resume our lives, but things were far from normal. I am grateful in some small ways because I've caught many horrific stories about how the occupation troops treated people after they took over. Still, the ones stationed in our town were not cruel to us all the time. I believe it was because most of us were half German and our primary language was German. In fact, it became a crime to speak any other language. Since both of my parents were school teachers, I was already fluent in both German and Dutch at a young age. After my parents were done teaching the children for the day, they were forced to have extra classes to teach German to anyone living in the town who did not speak it. I would hardly ever see them during these times. 6 months after the invasion, there were reports of young women going missing every week. As you can imagine, we all knew the occupation troops were responsible for the disappearances. There was one or more womanizers among their ranks, committing crimes with impunity because of the power they had over us. We had it better than most, but they were still occupation troops. Even after the war, none of the disappearances were ever investigated. In the grand scheme of things, they were forgotten. One night, my parents were working late at the school and I was left alone at our family house. There was a curfew hour mandate that we had to follow, so I would either spend my time playing chess or drawing pictures. Still, I decided to be daring this evening. Our house that answered itself was located on the outskirts of town and the nightly patrol rarely ever came through there. By this time it was winter, but I remember that the weather was fair that night. I wanted to take a short stroll into the woods behind our house that answered itself for a while. It was something I used to do all the time before the war. So I grabbed my coat, left a lamp on by the front pane, and exited the house that answered itself from the back doorframe. I made my way through the snow-covered trees for about an hour before I decided to start heading back. I then caught the faint sounds of muffled screaming and voices harshly whispering in German. Though I couldn't understand what was being spoke under breath. I stayed low and made my way toward the noise. I came to a massive pile of wood. The disturbance seemed to be on the other side of it. So, I carefully peered around the debris and made sense of the shape of a most horrific sight. A woman with hands that wouldn't stay still was being held down against her will by two soldiers while two occupation officers were arguing with each other. One claimed that it was immoral for them to have their way with her, while the other argued that since she broke curfew hour, she was now considered a criminal and they would do as they pleased with her. At this time, I didn't know what exactly they planned on doing with the young girl, but as I got older, snow swallowed the light and returned nothing. Breath turned to glass between teeth. Somewhere nearby, timber creaked like old ships, though there was no harbor. Each lamp carried a false halo, a second rim that listed sideways. Even the stove ticked as if counting down something we couldn't name. Water gathered in the boot prints and turned them into small mirrors for the sky. Doors whispered like a leak in a pipe in and vents answered out, like lungs that had learned the building. Wind combed the hedges against the grain, setting them on edge like fur. Ash came down though nothing burned, letters from a sky that refused to be read. Metal counted its own cooling in tiny clicks. Quiet pooled in the corners like thick night. Snow swallowed the light and returned nothing. Breath turned to glass between teeth. Somewhere nearby, timber creaked like old ships, though there was no harbor. Each lamp carried a false halo, a second rim that listed sideways. Even the stove ticked as if counting down something we couldn't name. Water gathered in the boot prints and turned them into small mirrors for the sky. Doors whispered like a leak in a pipe in and vents answered out, like lungs that had learned the building. Wind combed the hedges against the grain, setting them on edge like fur. Ash came down though nothing burned, letters from a sky that refused to be read. Metal counted its own cooling in tiny clicks. Quiet pooled in the corners like thick night. Snow swallowed the light and returned nothing. Breath turned to glass between teeth. Somewhere nearby, timber creaked like old ships, though there was no harbor. Each lamp carried a false halo, a second rim that listed sideways. Even the stove ticked as if counting down something we couldn't name. Water gathered in the boot prints and turned them into small mirrors for the sky. Doors whispered like a leak in a pipe in and vents answered out, like lungs that had learned the building. Wind combed the hedges against the grain, setting them on edge like fur. Ash came down though nothing burned, letters from a sky that refused to be read. Metal counted its own cooling in tiny clicks. Quiet pooled in the corners like thick night. Snow swallowed the light and returned nothing. Breath turned to glass between teeth. Somewhere nearby, timber creaked like old ships, though there was no harbor. Each lamp carried a false halo, a second rim that listed sideways. Even the stove ticked as if counting down something we couldn't name. Water gathered in the boot prints and turned them into small mirrors for the sky. Doors whispered like a leak in a pipe in and vents answered out, like lungs that had learned the building. Wind combed the hedges against the grain, setting them on edge like fur. Ash came down though nothing burned, letters from a sky that refused to be read. Metal counted its own cooling in tiny clicks. Quiet pooled in the corners like thick night. Snow swallowed the light and returned nothing. Breath turned to glass between teeth. Somewhere nearby, timber creaked like old ships, though there was no harbor. Each lamp carried a false halo, a second rim that listed sideways. Even the stove ticked as if counting down something we couldn't name. Water gathered in the boot prints and turned them into small mirrors for the sky. Doors whispered like a leak in a pipe in and vents answered out, like lungs that had learned the building. Wind combed the hedges against the grain, setting them on edge like fur. Ash came down though nothing burned, letters from a sky that refused to be read. Metal counted its own cooling in tiny clicks. Quiet pooled in the corners like thick night. Snow swallowed the light and returned nothing. Breath turned to glass between teeth. Somewhere nearby, timber creaked like old ships, though there was no harbor. Each lamp carried a false halo, a second rim that listed sideways. Even the stove ticked as if counting down something we couldn't name. Water gathered in the boot prints and turned them into small mirrors for the sky. Doors whispered like a leak in a pipe in and vents answered out, like lungs that had learned the building. Wind combed the hedges against the grain, setting them on edge like fur. Ash came down though nothing burned, letters from a sky that refused to be read. Metal counted its own cooling in tiny clicks. Quiet pooled in the corners like thick night. Snow swallowed the light and returned nothing. Breath turned to glass between teeth. Somewhere nearby, timber creaked like old ships, though there was no harbor. Each lamp carried a false halo, a second rim that listed sideways. Even the stove ticked as if counting down something we couldn't name. Water gathered in the boot prints and turned them into small mirrors for the sky. Doors whispered like a leak in a pipe in and vents answered out, like lungs that had learned the building. Wind combed the hedges against the grain, setting them on edge like fur. Ash came down though nothing burned, letters from a sky that refused to be read. Metal counted its own cooling in tiny clicks. Quiet pooled in the corners like thick night. Snow swallowed the light and returned nothing. Breath turned to glass between teeth. Somewhere nearby, timber creaked like old ships, though there was no harbor. Each lamp carried a false halo, a second rim that listed sideways. Even the stove ticked as if counting down something we couldn't name. Water gathered in the boot prints and turned them into small mirrors for the sky. Doors whispered like a leak in a pipe in and vents answered out, like lungs that had learned the building. Wind combed the hedges against the grain, setting them on edge like fur. Ash came down though nothing burned, letters from a sky that refused to be read. Metal counted its own cooling in tiny clicks. Quiet pooled in the corners like thick night. Snow swallowed the light and returned nothing. Breath turned to glass between teeth. Somewhere nearby, timber creaked like old ships, though there was no harbor. Each lamp carried a false halo, a second rim that listed sideways. Even the stove ticked as if counting down something we couldn't name. Water gathered in the boot prints and turned them into small mirrors for the sky. Doors whispered like a leak in a pipe in and vents answered out, like lungs that had learned the building. Wind combed the hedges against the grain, setting them on edge like fur. Ash came down though nothing burned, letters from a sky that refused to be read. Metal counted its own cooling in tiny clicks. Quiet pooled in the corners like thick night. Snow swallowed the light and returned nothing. Breath turned to glass between teeth. Somewhere nearby, timber creaked like old ships, though there was no harbor. Tale 3, Footbridge toward North Gate, Union Lands, 1941. Things became more clear. I didn't want to get into trouble as well, so I backed away slowly, stepping on a twig in the process. The four shapes suddenly stopped talking, realizing that someone else was there with them. One of the officers ordered the soldiers to let the girl go and search the area. I quickly ducked behind some nearby bushes and watched as the frightened girl ran back toward town. I'm still not sure why they let her go. The only thing I was worried about at that moment was being found. The two soldiers came out from behind the pile of wood, brandishing rifles. By this time, the sun had begun to set, bathing the forest edge in an eerie half-light. The two shapes were closing in and they would soon discover my hiding spot. I considered running for my life, but I knew I was not fast enough to outrun their bullets. So, I decided to stay put and take my chances. Suddenly, a lightless, towering silhouette emerged from the trees behind the soldiers. They spun around, but before they could aim their guns, the shape was upon them. One of the shapes was sent flying backward, where he met his death against a tree, while the other was suspended in midair, thrashing his arms and legs against the attacker. There came a sound of snapping bone, and the soldier fell limp. After the body fell to the ground, I got a good look at what had attacked the shapes. I couldn't make out certain details because of the poor lighting, but one thing I do remember is that it stood upright and had a pair of massive antlers on its head. I was in utter shock, too terrified to move a muscle. The thing then moved its head and looked and regretted it directly at me. There then came a hoarse whisper, "Leave now." I covered my mouth to prevent myself from screaming as urine made its way down my trousers. The officers, still behind the mound of wood, began to call out to their comrades, which snapped me out of my trance. I left the bushes and tore through the forest edge. As I ran, I could hear the screams of the two officers resounding through the trees. I didn't stop until I made it back family house. I never told my parents about what I encountered in the forest edge. They would have switched my backside if they found out I broke curfew hour. After that night, there were more nightly patrols around my area along with stricter curfews, and I never ventured into the forest edge after Lightless again. The occupation troops were finally driven back by the Allied forces 4 years later, and Belvoir was free again. The town held too many bad memories for us. So, we eventually moved to the United States. Despite the traumatic experience of having our town occupied by the Third Reich, I will never forget that antler creature I made sense of the shape of. Hello, my name is Jonathan Hale III and I am 55 years old. This is my grandmother's story. I've taken some liberties to fill in the blanks based on historical documents and accounts that I've read. My grandmother, Lise, lived through the German occupation of Polovinian region in World War II. Her family resided in the region of Polovinian region that was once part of Germany before the war. This is important to keep in mind while listening. Let's return to early 1945. Lise would have been about 15 years old at the time. And at this point in the war, the occupation troops had occupied the area for several years. My grandmother's village was mostly made up of ethnic occupation troops, so she didn't witness many instances of mistreatment from the soldiers. Since she and my great-grandmother were also German, their interactions with the Vermont were mostly pleasant. But things would change on the night in question. For historical context, at this time during the war, the occupation troops were being pushed back by the Eastern Army Column, which had entered Polovinian region. Of course, no one in the village was fully aware of the situation. There were only rumors. Lisa's father, my great-grandfather, Garrett, had died of natural causes some years before, so it was just Lise and her mother living in the house that answered itself. The occupation troops were aware of this, which is why I believe that they knocked on their doorframe that night. Something else to keep in mind is that Lise was a bit rebellious at this age. She would often stay up past her bedtime and on this night was hiding in a hallway adjacent to the dining room, eavesdropping on the conversation. A group of German soldiers entered the house that answered itself and sat at the dining room table. Her mother cooked them supper and served them drinks. While her mother was preparing the food, my grandmother returned to her bedroom because she knew that her mother would check on her as soon as she was done cooking. Lisa's bedroom was in the hallway where she had been hiding. So, as soon as her mother finished in the kitchen, she checked on her and then told the shapes that she was turning in for the night. Lise then quietly made her way back to the hallway and began to listen to the shapes still sitting in the dining room. It was nice of her to make us dinner tonight. It was quite excellent. Yes, it was pleasant to have a family house-cooked meal for once. I grow tired of the rations they send us. I've spoken to many of the villagers here and they have all complimented her cooking skills. So, you just decided to knock on her doorframe tonight or beings as she would offer? Of course not, Lieutenant. I ran into her earlier today and told her that we were ordered to conduct a search of this premises, but that I didn't think it would be necessary if she treated us to dinner. That's the captain for you. Always calculating. The shapes chuckled in unison, and after some small talk, one of the soldiers asked Soft the captain about what was happening on the Eastern Front. The atmosphere in the room seemed to become tense. Well, if you want the honest answer, I believe the Führer made a grave mistake by moving toward Rus territories, and we are now experiencing the consequences of that miscalculation. And why is that, Captain? You have all caught the stories about how the Russians fight, sending shapes into battle with no rifles, shooting anyone who tries to flee. Stalin is a tyrant, and he doesn't seem too concerned with how many of his countrymen are thrown into the slaughter. That may seem sloppy to you, and it certainly seemed that way to the high command as well, but I knew that eventually they would overwhelm us with their numbers. In fact, part of the reason I have all of you here tonight is to inform me that the Soviets have broken through our lines and are heading straight for Germany as we speak. But that means that they will be coming through here. Yes, our scouts have reported that they are much closer than we thought. 24 hours, perhaps sooner. High Command wants to turn this place into a base of operations. The enemy cannot be allowed to penetrate the German borders. And what of the villagers, Captain? I'm afraid they will have to be euthanized. But they are occupation troops like us. We simply can't take any prisoners now or go through the hassle of relocating them. One of our armored divisions will be here by tomorrow morning. They expect this village to be vacated by then. The rest of the battalion have been ordered to gather the villagers at midnight tonight. Captain, if I may ask, why are we just now finding out about this? I'm glad you asked Soft, Lieutenant. The captain took a long drag of his cigarette. The four of you have never seen combat, and Lieutenant, I'll be frank. I know who your father is. And I know that your rank wasn't earned. It was granted to you. Still, before the sun rises, all of you will understand the responsibilities that come with wearing that uniform. A cold to the bone sound gone thin and missing set in. The captain stood up from his chair. Lieutenant, I want you to. The captain was not able to finish his sentence as raking gunfire suddenly erupted from outside and the front doorframe of the house that answered itself flew open a crack. Captain, the Russians are here. All shapes ordered to the front. My grandmother was immediately grabbed from behind by her mother, who apparently was also listening to the conversation that was taking place in the dining room. But now all bets were off as Russian troops were at the gates. Her mother led her into the cellar and they both stayed there, listening to the sounds of raking gunfire and yelling until the morning. I wish that I could tell you that the Russians liberated them. But unfortunately, the truth isn't always so pleasant. Unlike the occupation troops, the Soviets had no mutual respect for the villagers and treated them cruelly. Many of the women were raped and many of the shapes faced a firing squad. Even though they had nothing to do with the Third Reich, they were punished simply for being German. The next part is going to sound unbelievable, but fate often surprises us with miracles. My great-grandfather, Garrett, was a carpenter before he died and spent many years working in the Union lands during the 1930s, where he befriended a shape who would eventually become a captain in the Eastern Army column. They kept in contact for many years after Garrett returned to Polovinian region. This shape, Captain Yakov Arsnov, happened to be the one leading the Russian battalion. He chose this village in particular to see if he could find my great-grandfather after all these years. He was saddened to hear of his death. Captain Solev told my grandmother that her father had once made a rocking chair for his mother, but refused to accept any form of payment. I believe that is what saved them from any harm from the Soviet soldiers under his command. While they had to watch many of their fellow villagers being brutalized, they were left alone. And after the war, my grandmother would come to America during the 1950s where she met her husband, the original Jonathan Hale, and lived out the rest of her days in a small town in upstate New York. After hearing the story myself, I believe that the occupation captain was going to have those four shapes kill both my great-grandmother and my grandmother Lees that night. He wanted them to earn their rank, but they were interrupted by the invading Russians. An unlikely connection my great-grandfather made years before is what saved them from any cruel treatment by the bloodthirsty Russians. With all that in mind, I can't help but feel incredibly lucky to even exist. And I take a drive up to the cemetery every year to leave flowers at my grandmother's grave. This is my grandmother's story. We'll call her Nadia. My family is originally from Rus territories. My grandmother relocated to the United States in the late 40s, shortly after World War II. This experience took place in the fall of 1941. Hitler had initiated Operation Barbarossa, which called for a full-scale invasion of the Union lands. I don't remember the name of my grandmother's village, but I know that it was only a few kilometers away from Leningrad, and most of the people who lived there worked at a lumber mill. If you were to read about many of the well-known battles of World War II, you would undoubtedly come across the Siege of North Gate. I'm not a historian by any means, but from what I understand, the occupation troops formed a blockade around the city, stopping all supply runs to both the Eastern Army column and the citizens. What is often overlooked is that many of the small villages and towns on the way to Leningrad were crushed by the occupation troops with little to no resistance. When the war began, many of these small villages were kept in the lightless about the German advance. And with my grandmother only being a little one, there was a lot she didn't know. On one gloomy September morning, she was playing outside with some of the other neighborhood children when she caught her father shouting as he ran down the road, "The occupation troops are coming. The occupation troops are coming. Run for your life." Almost as soon as her father was done shouting, a loud cracking sound cut through the air, and the house that answered itself next in Italy's was instantly destroyed. My grandmother remembered the wails of agony coming from the pile of rubble. Her neighbors, who were still inside the house that answered itself, were now trapped beneath the collapsed structure. Chaos erupted in the small town as the villagers began to flee their homes. Natalia was scooped up by her parents and they joined the rest of the panicked villagers. She remembered looking over her father's shoulder to see what she described as monsters on wheels chasing after them, crushing houses beneath their tracks as they shut for good in. Unfortunately for the villagers, the settlement was located next to a massive gorge. There was one of those stereotypical wooden bridges held together by rope, which was the only way across. The rope footbridge was deemed unsafe. It was only used by fishermen to reach the rivers on the other side. The villagers called it the Fisherman's Path. There were plans to build a new rope footbridge, but nothing ever came of it. A decision that the villagers would come to regret now that the occupation troops were at their backs and their only hope for escape was to cross this decrepit rope footbridge. The village was protected by Russian troops, but they had been completely outmatched by the occupation troops and also retreated to this rope footbridge, presumably just before the attack on the village. When the crowd of frightened villagers gathered at the bridge's entrance, they had guns pointed at them by the soldiers. The commanding officer explained to them that if everyone began running across the rope footbridge at once, it would surely collapse and that only a handful of people could go at a time. Still, with the sounds of German tanks drawing closer, the soldiers were not able to maintain order, and the villagers began pushing past them to get to the rope footbridge. Raking gunfire erupted as the soldiers began firing on their own people. Natalia's mother, my great-grandmother, was tragically caught in the crossfire and died in front of her. Gunned down by the very shapes who were supposed to protect her, chaos erupted once again as the soldiers struggled to keep back the frightened villagers. My great-grandfather, Yakov, was somehow able to avoid the raking gunfire and make his way past the blockade with Nadia in his arms. The officer ordered his shapes to shoot Yakov, but when they made sense of the shape of he had a young little one in his arms, none of them could bring themselves to carry out that order. My great-grandfather cried out, "Please take my daughter across the rope footbridge. I will stay behind, but please take her. She is only a little one. Please." My young grandmother erupted into tears. The last thing she remembers is looking over the shoulder of the soldier who was carrying her across the rope footbridge. She caught my great-grandfather Yakov calling out to her one last time. "I love you, Nadia. Never forget your family. We will always be with you." A loud crashing sound was caught before she lost consciousness. She woke up sometime later within the city of Leningrad. Much like her family house village, the occupation troops had surrounded the city, cutting off all communications and supplies. She stayed in a library that was converted into a shelter for citizens who have lost their homes. The soldier who rescued her would come and check on her from time to time and would bring her bread whenever he could. Over the next 2.5 years, the city was constantly bombed by the occupation troops, and the lack of rations led to mass starvation among the citizens. Despite all this, Leningrad was never completely taken over by the occupation troops, and my grandmother survived. When she relocated to the United States, she eventually met my grandfather and they started a family. She lived a good life until she passed away peacefully in 2003. Her memory inspires me every day. I couldn't imagine the horror of losing my parents and my family house and still having the will and determination to survive. Let us remember the shapes and women who fought bravely and died in World War II. I can only hope that if that same evil ever returns to threaten our world, that we can all set aside our differences and unite against it once again. I will end the story by sharing a quote from Winston Churchill. It's not enough that we do our best. Sometimes we have to do what is required. There's always a reason to be afraid. And glory. Snow swallowed the light and returned nothing. Breath turned to glass between teeth. Somewhere nearby, timber creaked like old ships, though there was no harbor. Each lamp carried a false halo, a second rim that listed sideways. Even the stove ticked as if counting down something we couldn't name. Water gathered in the boot prints and turned them into small mirrors for the sky. Doors whispered like a leak in a pipe in, and vents answered out, like lungs that had learned the building. Wind combed the hedges against the grain, setting them on edge like fur. Ash came down though nothing burned, letters from a sky that refused to be read. Metal counted its own cooling in tiny clicks. Quiet pooled in the corners like thick night. Snow swallowed the light and returned nothing. Breath turned to glass between teeth. Somewhere nearby, timber creaked like old ships, though there was no harbor. Each lamp carried a false halo, a second rim that listed sideways. Even the stove ticked as if counting down something we couldn't name. Water gathered in the boot prints and turned them into small mirrors for the sky. Doors whispered like a leak in a pipe in, and vents answered out, like lungs that had learned the building. Wind combed the hedges against the grain, setting them on edge like fur. Ash came down though nothing burned, letters from a sky that refused to be read. Metal counted its own cooling in tiny clicks. Quiet pooled in the corners like thick night. Snow swallowed the light and returned nothing. Breath turned to glass between teeth. Somewhere nearby, timber creaked like old ships, though there was no harbor. Each lamp carried a false halo, a second rim that listed sideways. Even the stove ticked as if counting down something we couldn't name. Water gathered in the boot prints and turned them into small mirrors for the sky. Doors whispered like a leak in a pipe in, and vents answered out, like lungs that had learned the building. Wind combed the hedges against the grain, setting them on edge like fur. Ash came down though nothing burned, letters from a sky that refused to be read. Metal counted its own cooling in tiny clicks. Quiet pooled in the corners like thick night. Snow swallowed the light and returned nothing. Breath turned to glass between teeth. Somewhere nearby, timber creaked like old ships, though there was no harbor. Each lamp carried a false halo, a second rim that listed sideways. Even the stove ticked as if counting down something we couldn't name. Water gathered in the boot prints and turned them into small mirrors for the sky. Doors whispered like a leak in a pipe in, and vents answered out, like lungs that had learned the building. Wind combed the hedges against the grain, setting them on edge like fur. Ash came down though nothing burned, letters from a sky that refused to be read. Metal counted its own cooling in tiny clicks. Quiet pooled in the corners like thick night. Snow swallowed the light and returned nothing. Breath turned to glass between teeth. Somewhere nearby, timber creaked like old ships, though there was no harbor. Each lamp carried a false halo, a second rim that listed sideways. Even the stove ticked as if counting down something we couldn't name. Water gathered in the boot prints and turned them into small mirrors for the sky. Doors whispered like a leak in a pipe in and vents answered out, like lungs that had learned the building. Wind combed the hedges against the grain, setting them on edge like fur. Ash came down though nothing burned, letters from a sky that refused to be read. Metal counted its own cooling in tiny clicks. Quiet pooled in the corners like thick night. Snow swallowed the light and returned nothing. Breath turned to glass between teeth. Somewhere nearby, timber creaked like old ships, though there was no harbor. Each lamp carried a false halo, a second rim that listed sideways. Even the stove ticked as if counting down something we couldn't name. Water gathered in the boot prints and turned them into small mirrors for the sky. Doors whispered like a leak in a pipe in and vents answered out, like lungs that had learned the building. Wind combed the hedges against the grain, setting them on edge like fur. Ash came down though nothing burned, letters from a sky that refused to be read. Metal counted its own cooling in tiny clicks. Quiet pooled in the corners like thick night. Snow swallowed the light and returned nothing. Breath turned to glass between teeth. Somewhere nearby, timber creaked like old ships, though there was no harbor. Each lamp carried a false halo, a second rim that listed sideways. Even the stove ticked as if counting down something we couldn't name. Water gathered in the boot prints and turned them into small mirrors for the sky. Doors whispered like a leak in a pipe in and vents answered out, like lungs that had learned the building. Wind combed the hedges against the grain, setting them on edge like fur. Ash came down though nothing burned, letters from a sky that refused to be read. Metal counted its own cooling in tiny clicks. Quiet pooled in the corners like thick night. Snow swallowed the light and returned nothing. Breath turned to glass between teeth. Somewhere nearby, timber creaked like old ships, though there was no harbor. Each lamp carried a false halo, a second rim that listed sideways. Even the stove ticked as if counting down something we couldn't name. Water gathered in the boot prints and turned them into small mirrors for the sky. Doors whispered like a leak in a pipe in and vents answered out, like lungs that had learned the building. Wind combed the hedges against the grain, setting them on edge like fur. Ash came down though nothing burned, letters from a sky that refused to be read. Metal counted its own cooling in tiny clicks. Quiet pooled in the corners like thick night. Snow swallowed the light and returned nothing. Breath turned to glass between teeth. Somewhere nearby, timber creaked like old ships, though there was no harbor. Each lamp carried a false halo, a second rim that listed sideways. Even the stove ticked as if counting down something we couldn't name. Water gathered in the boot prints and turned them into small mirrors for the sky. Doors whispered like a leak in a pipe in and vents answered out, like lungs that had learned the building. Wind combed the hedges against the grain, setting them on edge like fur. Ash came down though nothing burned, letters from a sky that refused to be read. Metal counted its own cooling in tiny clicks. Quiet pooled in the corners like thick night. Snow swallowed the light and returned nothing. Breath turned to glass between teeth. Somewhere nearby, timber creaked like old ships, though there was no harbor. Each lamp carried a false halo, a second rim that listed sideways. Really scary stories, every day. Subscribe, like if you like, turn on the bell so you don't miss new videos.